The ninja didn't disappear because they failed. They disappeared because Japan chose a different kind of power. Not shadows, but banners. Not invisibility, but obedience. Subscribe to fragments of history for dark, real stories history tried to erase. Like the video if you want the truth, not the myth. And comment below what city you're watching from. There were two kinds of power in feudal Japan, and they were structurally incompatible. One moved through shadows, sold outcomes, and fed on disorder. The other stood in daylight, carried authority, and demanded order. The ninja and the samurai weren't simply different roles on the same battlefield. They were competing architectures of power. And once Japan decided which architecture would define its future, one world couldn't be allowed to remain. The ninja represented informal power, decentralized, invisible, difficult to audit. They lived outside official hierarchies, operating through agreements instead of oaths. Their strength wasn't just skill, it was deniability. No banner announced them, no registry could fully contain them. Their work produced results without clear attribution. Solutions for problems a lord couldn't acknowledge in public. Information that couldn't be gathered openly. Actions that couldn't be traced back to the hand that ordered them. Their advantage was autonomy. Ungovernable, adaptable, and hard to punish because they were hard to locate. The samurai represented formal power. Centralized, visible, engineered for control. They existed inside strict command structures, defined by public loyalty and enforceable obligation. Their strength wasn't secrecy, it was legitimacy. Everyone knew which lord they served. Everyone could see which authority they embodied. They were the state's recognized violence, discipline wearing a name, a crest, a chain of command. Their value was predictability, traceable, controllable, integrated into the system that rewarded obedience and punished deviation. These weren't two roads to the same destination. They were different beliefs about how a society should be held together. The ninja model assumed fragmentation. It thrived when Japan was divided into competing domains, when borders shifted, when information was scarce, when authority was uncertain. In that environment, informal power became priceless. Lords needed things done that could not be said aloud. Intelligence that official channels couldn't reach. Pressure applied where honor, law, or reputation made open action impossible. The ninja existed because the system had gaps, and because those gaps were useful. The samurai model assumed centralization. It flourished when authority hardened into a single structure, when hierarchy became stable, when obedience could be tracked and enforced. In that environment, formal power was everything. The state needed clear loyalty and reliable enforcement. It needed violence that could be authorized, measured, and directed. It needed order that looked like order, public, ritualized, undeniable. During the Sengoku period, both models could coexist because Japan itself was broken into pieces. Warlords operated as semi-independent powers. Each domain needed a visible sword and an invisible hand. Samurai represented control at home, policing, enforcing, embodying rule. Ninja represented disruption abroad, infiltrating, observing, destabilizing rivals. One protected the structure, the other exploited the fractures. For a time, the contradiction was manageable because the country was a contradiction. But coexistence was never a stable equilibrium. It was a temporary arrangement forced by chaos. As Japan moved toward unification, toward centralized authority, and eventually the Tokugawa order, the compatibility vanished. A unified state does not merely prefer formal power, it requires it. Centralization isn't just an administrative choice. It's a demand that all coercion and intelligence flow through official channels. Every operator must be accountable. Every action must be traceable to a chain of command. Every weapon, every secret, every source of influence must be supervised. In that context, the ninja model wasn't merely old-fashioned. It was structurally hostile to the future being built. This is what modern myth often hides. The conflict between ninja and samurai wasn't primarily personal. It wasn't a rivalry of warrior pride or a moral contest between honor and dishonor. It was political engineering. Japan couldn't be both a state of formal obedience and a marketplace of informal force. One system required gaps, spaces where autonomous specialists could move, negotiate, and disappear. The other system required the elimination of gaps. And when the goal became absolute stability, autonomy stopped being useful and started being intolerable. The samurai represented obedience, visible, documented, enforceable obedience to recognized authority. The ninja represented autonomy, invisible, undocumented, negotiable autonomy from any single authority. And when a state begins to build permanent control, autonomy becomes a threat, even when it claims to serve the same side. Not because it is evil, but because it is unbounded. Some ninja groups saw the horizon shifting and tried to adapt. They sought official status. They offered their skills to lords in more formal ways, trying to become retainers instead of contractors, to translate secrecy into sanctioned service. But the transformation could never fully succeed. A ninja operating under direct oversight stops being what made a ninja valuable in the first place. Once you remove independence, you remove the very mechanism that produced deniability and flexibility. What remains is a sanctioned specialist, useful, yes, but no longer outside the system, no longer a separate world. Others kept operating as they always had, independent operators in a country that was erasing independence. They became relics of a fractured age, trying to survive inside a new political reality that no longer needed them and feared what they represented. And that fear wasn't abstract. A centralized regime can tolerate many things: brutality, inequality, even corruption. What it cannot tolerate is a parallel capacity for violence and intelligence that doesn't belong to it completely, because the moment such a capacity exists, control becomes conditional, power becomes negotiable, the state becomes something you can work around. The collision between these two worlds wasn't one dramatic duel. It was a slow tightening of the grip, decade by decade, as Japan shifted from warring states to organized authority. And once that shift began, the ending was embedded in the structure. The samurai world wasn't just stronger, it was the model that matched the future being built. The ninja world wasn't defeated by weakness, it was defeated by incompatibility. Both systems worked. The ninja were effective, the samurai were effective, but survival didn't belong to the most skilled. It belonged to what could be controlled. So if ninja were this useful, if they could deliver results no army could, why did the emerging state start treating them like a structural threat instead of an asset? Because the moment a government tries to make power predictable, the first thing it learns to fear is the kind of power it can't supervise. States don't just want power, they want predictable power, the kind they can deploy with confidence, knowing what will happen, who will do it, and who will be held responsible if it goes wrong. That isn't paranoia, it's the logic of governance, and it's why the samurai system became the backbone of Japanese authority, while the ninja model hardened into something the state could no longer tolerate. Samurai were predictable because their existence was legible. Their names, lineages, stipends, and lords were recorded. When a samurai served a daimyo, that relationship existed on paper and in public ritual. When allegiance shifted, it was marked, witnessed, formalized. A samurai's loyalties could be traced through roles, through obligations, through the visible architecture of the class itself. This wasn't mere paperwork. It was the infrastructure of control. The system functioned through clear chains of command that left little room for ambiguity. A samurai answered to a specific lord. That lord answered upward, toward higher authority, toward the shogunate's structure. Orders moved down those chains. Accountability moved back up. If a samurai acted, you could follow the action to whoever authorized it. If something went wrong, the system could identify where discipline failed, where supervision broke, where responsibility belonged. Scale demands clarity, and the samurai model was built for scale. Compensation reinforced obedience. Stipends, often measured in koku, and land grants were not simply rewards, they were restraints. A samurai's survival depended on remaining inside the hierarchy. To break away meant losing income, losing status, losing the material ground beneath their identity. Loyalty wasn't only moral theater, it was economically rational, reinforced by dependence, and most importantly, violence under the samurai system was authorized. When a samurai killed, he did so as an extension of recognized authority. His actions carried the weight of his lord's legitimacy within the political order. This authorization drew the line between sanctioned force and criminal force. It turned killing into enforcement because the state could name it, claim it, and punish it when necessary. The ninja operated outside all of this. They weren't registered in the same way. There were no official roles that reliably tracked which groups served which lords, or when those relationships changed. Their loyalties were contractual, often secret by design. You couldn't trace them through paper trails because their survival depended on erasing trails. They could work for one lord today and another tomorrow, and the shift might leave no record at all. Operationally, this opacity was useful. Politically, it was intolerable. There was no command chain in the ninja world that resembled samurai hierarchy. A lord could hire them, but not truly contain them. The relationship was transactional. Objectives were agreed upon, but methods remained in the hands of the operator. There were no layers of supervisors watching execution in real time, no predictable system of reporting, no visible discipline that could be audited. You got results, but you didn't control the process, and for a state trying to make power predictable, that difference is everything. Even the payment model carried its own threat. Ninja compensation was project-based. Pay for outcomes, not for lifelong loyalty. That created a different alignment. A samurai's long-term welfare depended on his lord's continued strength and favor. A ninja's income depended on contracts, whatever the broader political weather. In that sense, instability wasn't simply a condition of their work, it could become fuel for it. The incentives leaned toward fragmentation, not consolidation. Most dangerously, ninja violence was never fully authorized in the same way. Even when employed by legitimate lords, their actions lived in legal shadow. If a ninja killed someone, the death was meant to be unclaimed. Employers benefited from deniability precisely because the act could not be acknowledged. Without admitting to methods the official order could not publicly endorse. That deniability made ninja valuable in certain moments. But it also meant their violence always carried the residue of criminality, an action the state could use but could not cleanly absorb. For an emerging centralized regime, that entire model was a structural defect. The Tokugawa project required a world where force and intelligence moved through documented, supervised, accountable channels. The state needed to know who held coercive capability, who authorized its use, and who could be punished if it was misused. The samurai system provided this with brutal efficiency. The ninja system was designed to evade it. And this is where autonomy becomes a threat, not because autonomous operators are automatically hostile, but because autonomy is unknowable until the moment it turns. An unsupervised force can remain loyal for years and still represent a risk because the state cannot verify loyalty through control. Without supervision, you don't find out the truth until consequences arrive. This is the fear of unsupervised power, not that it will be misused, but that it could be, and you may not see it coming. For a regime obsessed with stability, potential threats are treated as real threats. The possibility of betrayal becomes indistinguishable from betrayal itself, and once a state reaches that mindset, the solution is never partial. It is the removal of the possibility. The samurai system solved the problem the state cared about most. Warriors were visible. Their identities and obligations were known. Their livelihoods were tied to the hierarchy. Their violence was legally framed and socially policed. They couldn't easily shift allegiance without consequence. They couldn't operate independently without detection. In every meaningful sense, they were extensions of official power, not parallel power. The ninja preserved exactly what the state was trying to erase: autonomous judgment, unclear loyalty, hidden operations, deniable action. These traits made them priceless during fragmentation. They made them unacceptable during consolidation. Once centralized control became the future, coexistence stopped being an option. This wasn't about one group being better. It wasn't even truly about honor versus pragmatism. It was about compatibility. One system could be absorbed into total governance, the other could not, and the state chose what it could control. But the problem went deeper than control. Because having autonomous operators outside the system was dangerous in one way. Having autonomous operators who carried knowledge, methods, networks, secrets that could not be unlearned and could not be reliably erased was dangerous in another. And that was the kind of danger a new regime doesn't negotiate with. The ninja weren't just operationally autonomous. They were epistemologically dangerous, carriers of knowledge the state couldn't seize, skills it couldn't fully supervise, and networks it couldn't reliably map. Even when they served a lord's interests, they remained structurally outside the lord's system. And for a regime building total control, anything outside the system is intolerable, no matter whose side it claims to be on. The root problem was simple. Ninja responded to contracts, not banners. A samurai swore oaths to a lord, anchored by codes that made betrayal culturally catastrophic and legally punishable. Breaking those bonds meant social death long before physical consequences arrived. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was the scaffolding of identity. But ninja didn't live inside that scaffolding. They negotiated terms, completed objectives, and moved on. Today's employer could become tomorrow's target without moral contradiction because loyalty was never the premise. Outcomes were. That model made allegiance perpetually negotiable. A samurai couldn't shift sides without tearing away their name, status, and future. A ninja clan could work one contract for a domain, accept another from its rival, then disappear into a third arrangement altogether. The restraints were professional reputation and market calculation, not taboo, not law, not public shame. Politically, that meant you could never be sure what you had actually bought. But the deeper threat wasn't loyalty, it was knowledge. A ninja who had worked for you didn't just know how to fight. They knew you, layouts, weak points, guard rotations, habits, communication routes, private rivalries, who could be bribed, who could be threatened. That knowledge did not expire when payment stopped. It couldn't be confiscated like a weapon, and it couldn't be erased by decree. Even killing individuals didn't solve the problem, because the most dangerous knowledge wasn't always held by a single body. It was distributed, stored in a clan's memory, passed along in methods and routines. Intelligence gathered for you today could reappear against you tomorrow, not as rumor, but as precise leverage. Samurai didn't present the same structural risk because their knowledge was largely positional, not clandestine. They understood administration, warfare, command, skills taught openly and reproduced widely. A samurai who changed allegiance brought manpower and experience, but not necessarily a private map of how to breach your gates, how to move unseen through your household, how to strike where you would never defend because you never expected to be seen. The ninja offered asymmetric advantage, exactly the kind of advantage a consolidating state cannot tolerate outside its grasp. And the problem wasn't limited to information. Ninja capability itself was universally transferable. Infiltration techniques, disguise, architectural exploitation, manipulation. These methods worked against any domain because they targeted the human and structural weaknesses that every domain shared. A clan that could penetrate your enemy's defenses could penetrate yours just as easily. There was no way to become immune to the weapon you hired. You could only pray it stayed pointed outward. That created a security logic with no stable solution. To control ninja completely was to destroy what made them valuable. Their effectiveness depended on operating beyond ordinary constraints. But allowing them to operate beyond constraints meant they could operate against you. The state faced an unbearable equation. As long as the capability existed anywhere, it threatened everyone. And once unification became the objective, the safest answer was not management. It was removal. Some lords believed integration could solve it. Bring ninja clans into formal service, offer stipends, bind them with oaths, put them on the same leash as samurai. But the idea collapsed under its own weight. A ninja who works under constant oversight, within transparent procedure, inside a rigid command chain, stops being what a ninja was hired to be. The moment you make them safe, you also make them redundant. An unconventional samurai, not an independent operator. Others tried a softer solution, loyalty through generosity. Pay well, treat fairly, build long relationships. But economic loyalty is still loyalty with an expiration date. It lasts only as long as conditions hold. Until a better offer appears, until the political wind changes, until your domain weakens. In a Japan moving toward consolidation, conditions were never stable. Yesterday's generous patron could be tomorrow's defeated lord. And a contractor doesn't die for a sinking employer. From the state's viewpoint, the calculus was colder. Individual warlords tolerated ninja because the alternative was vulnerability. In a fractured landscape, intelligence meant survival. Everyone hired them because everyone feared being the only one who didn't. But a consolidating regime doesn't operate under that same pressure. Once unification becomes the goal, parallel structures of force and intelligence stop being useful tools and become potential resistance. Anything you can't fully command might one day refuse command. Even allied ninja were dangerous because their allegiance was contingent. Today, they operate in your service. Tomorrow they may not, because their loyalty is not absolute, only purchased. You cannot build stable governance on purchased discretion. You need loyalty that is enforced structurally, loyalty made rational by dependency and punishment. The samurai system created those mechanisms. The ninja system existed specifically outside them. This is why ninja shifted from valuable asset to existential threat. In fragmentation, their utility outweighed their risk. In consolidation, the equation flipped. A strong central authority could survive without them, and began to see them not as an advantage, but as a weapon that could be turned inward. Better to destroy a tool than allow it to remain a potential knife against your own consolidation. The impossibility of control was the final verdict. You couldn't partially control ninja. Either they retained the autonomy that made them effective, or they submitted to supervision that made them unnecessary. There was no middle ground. And since the state demanded total control, there was no accommodation left to negotiate. Some clans saw the wall approaching and tried to change shape. They offered their knowledge, their techniques, their permanent loyalty to the rising order. But transformation had a price. Secrecy became transparency, autonomy became obedience, contracts became hierarchy. What survived wasn't the ninja world. It was fragments of ninja technique grafted onto a system built to police it. Those who refused weren't always treated as open enemies. They were something worse, uncontrolled elements inside a machine demanding universal control. And once that machine grew strong enough, uncontrolled elements were not tolerated. They were removed. But the real acceleration came from a single figure who understood this logic without hesitation and had the will to apply it. A man who didn't merely want to rule Japan. He wanted to erase every autonomous power that could ever threaten his control. Oda Nobunaga didn't just unify Japan with armies. He rewired the logic of power itself. In his design, there was no room for intermediaries, no tolerance for autonomous forces, and no patience for groups that operated beyond direct supervision. The ninja weren't collateral damage from his campaigns. They were casualties of his vision, and that vision demanded their removal. Earlier warlords had learned to survive inside fragmentation. Traditional daimyo accepted that Japan was divided and treated division as terrain, something to navigate, exploit, bargain with. They built alliances, negotiated with rivals, and relied on power brokers to bridge the gaps that official authority couldn't cover. Ninja belonged to that world. They were tools for a landscape where control was incomplete and always contested. Nobunaga saw that landscape as the enemy. He didn't want to be the strongest lord in a system of competing lords. He wanted to end the system. Not dominance within fragmentation, but the elimination of fragmentation itself. And if power was going to be unified, then the means of power, violence, intelligence, enforcement, had to be unified too. Anything that remained autonomous was not merely inconvenient, it was a rival principle. That is why he moved against every independent power center he could reach. Religious institutions with private armies, merchant structures that controlled routes and resources, regional strongholds that resisted outside command. He didn't treat these as partners to be managed. He treated them as obstacles to be erased. Subordination still left something intact, an identity, a structure, a memory of independence. Erasure removed the possibility. The same logic applied to intelligence. Under Nobunaga, intelligence could no longer remain a semi-independent service purchased on the side. He didn't want networks that existed beyond his sight, even if they delivered results. He built information systems that reported upward through his own chain. Scouts became official instruments. Reports became administrative products. Surveillance became an extension of command. It wasn't always as flexible as hiring autonomous specialists, but it was controllable, and control mattered more than flexibility once force was centralized. Samurai became the machinery that made this possible, not only as fighters, but as administrators, enforcers, observers, whatever the state needed. Nobunaga expanded their function because they fit the structure. They could be registered, supervised, disciplined, and held accountable within a hierarchy. Anything that had once been outsourced to specialists could be pulled inward and assigned to retainers whose loyalty and identity were already bound to the system. This created a new model of power: total vertical integration. Older arrangements had been partially horizontal. Multiple specialist groups operating in parallel, coordinated loosely, useful precisely because they were not fully absorbed. Nobunaga's model was vertical. Everything flowed through him. Every capability existed as an extension of his will, managed by his appointees, enforced through clear chains of command. It was ruthlessly coherent, and it could not coexist with parallel structures. That is why Iga became more than a region. It became a symbol. Iga was the most visible concentration of the older logic, ninja clans operating with relative openness, maintaining a semi-autonomous confederation that did not answer to an external lord in the way the new order required. They did not need to be actively hostile to Nobunaga to be unacceptable. Structural independence was enough. Their existence proved that power could still exist outside unified authority, and for Nobunaga, proof was danger. He couldn't simply absorb Iga without undermining his own project. Absorption would send the message that autonomous power centers were permitted as long as they offered service. It would make independence negotiable. His entire architecture depended on the opposite principle. Autonomy would not be accommodated. It would be destroyed. Iga had to be erased to establish the rule that only state-supervised power could exist. The logic was simple and brutal. Ninja represented force outside his control. Even when they worked for him, they remained outside the system that made obedience enforceable. Their loyalty was contractual, not structural. Their methods depended on autonomy he could not safely supervise, and the capabilities that made them useful could be turned against him by anyone who gained access through money, leverage, or shifting circumstance. As long as autonomous ninja existed, a threat existed. Alignment could change. Contracts could shift. Knowledge could travel. Some argued for co-option, bring major clans into formal service, offer positions, bind them with rewards and obligations. But Nobunaga understood what co-option could not solve. Even loyal ninja would retain networks, techniques, and a culture shaped by independence. You cannot truly supervise what has been learned and internalized. You can't reliably confiscate knowledge. You can only prevent it from circulating by removing those who hold it and stopping new generations from inheriting it. That is why he chose eradication over absorption. Absorption keeps the capability alive and merely redirects it. Eradication attempts to eliminate the capability itself. It meant losing access to certain methods, but Nobunaga's calculus didn't depend on perfect intelligence. He believed overwhelming force, combined with state-integrated information gathering, was sufficient. In that framework, removing potential threats was more valuable than preserving potential tools. This decision wasn't just strategic, it was philosophical. Power, in Nobunaga's vision, should be monopolized, visible, and accountable to a single source. Anything rooted in shadows, autonomy, and split loyalty was not a supplement to state power, it was its opposite. Ninja were not merely inconvenient actors in his wars. They embodied the kind of power his Japan could not allow to survive. That is what separated him from earlier unifiers. Others sought supremacy within existing patterns. Nobunaga tried to replace the pattern itself. He didn't want to be the Lord Ninja served. He wanted a Japan where the conditions that produced ninja no longer existed, because there were no gaps left to exploit. His campaigns against Iga were extraordinarily brutal, even by Sengoku standards. This wasn't only about removing a tactical problem, it was demonstration. A warning to every autonomous structure still standing. The new order would not negotiate with independence, it would erase it. Others understood the message. Some dissolved quietly. Some sought formal roles that stripped away what made them distinct. Some fled beyond his immediate reach, but flight only delayed the same logic. Geography could offer temporary refuge. The ideology of centralized power would eventually arrive. Nobunaga died before completing his vision, but he left a template behind, methods, expectations, and an intolerance that his successors would inherit. Figures like Tokugawa Ieyasu would take what Nobunaga began and turn it into lasting structure. A Japan where the samurai system was the only permissible model of organized force. But eliminating ninja wasn't enough. A state can't simply destroy a capability and leave the space empty. It has to replace the function. And the way the samurai world replaced the ninja world revealed something cold about how governments work when they decide a certain kind of power is too dangerous to exist outside their control. The genius of the Tokugawa system wasn't merely that it destroyed the ninja, it made them unnecessary. Destruction creates martyrs and leaves functional voids. Replacement eliminates both the capability and the need. The Tokugawa regime absorbed the roles the ninja once filled so completely that within 2 generations, people began to forget why those roles had ever been outsourced at all. Espionage became bureaucratized. During the Sengoku period, warlords hired ninja because they lacked institutional machinery for systematic information gathering. Intelligence was improvised, purchased, and deniable. The Tokugawa regime built something different: permanent capacity. Official intelligence organs staffed by samurai retainers, operating under legal authority, clear mandates, and direct supervision. Not autonomous specialists drifting between employers, but state functionaries whose work belonged to the system. That distinction mattered more than any technique. Ninja gathered information through infiltration, deception, and covert observation because they had to. The state gathered information through authority to demand it. A census did not require stealth. It arrived with authorization and compelled compliance. Tax assessment did not require hidden watchers. It arrived as official inspection backed by enforcement. Once the regime had the power to make society legible, it didn't need shadows. It used paperwork, orders, and penalties. It replaced stealth with compulsion, and compulsion was more efficient once the state could enforce it. Informant networks became official and compensated. Ninja networks had relied on personal relationships, bribery, and quiet leverage. Contacts built through trust, fear, or money. The Tokugawa system formalized what had once been informal. Communities were reorganized into structures that monitored themselves. Reporting ceased to be a private arrangement and became a civic obligation. Temple registries tracked households. Local associations monitored neighbors. Suspicion could be forwarded upward through channels the state controlled, rather than whispered through networks it couldn't see. Administrative surveillance was more powerful than covert surveillance precisely because it never ended. A ninja might infiltrate, observe, report, and vanish. Administrative surveillance didn't vanish. It embedded itself into daily life. It didn't need dramatic operations to gather intelligence, because intelligence became a byproduct of ordinary governance. Who lived where, who moved, who paid, who met, who changed. The regime didn't send specialists to extract information. It built a society that produced information continuously. Laws replaced secret networks. Ninja had been valuable because they could operate beyond legal limits. They could sabotage, steal, intimidate, kill, whatever the contract demanded, without being accountable in a courtroom. The Tokugawa order criminalized those same capabilities while creating official, legal mechanisms that achieved similar ends under state supervision. Assassination became execution. Seizure became legal confiscation. Intelligence gathering became authorized investigation. The regime didn't need deniable actors to do illegal work. It created institutions that could do comparable work legally and openly, protected by the state's own definition of legitimacy. Samurai absorbed roles of internal control. Earlier, samurai were primarily the visible arm of military power, guardians of domains, enforcers of local order, symbols of authority. Under Tokugawa stability, the samurai role expanded until it covered nearly everything: police, investigators, inspectors, administrators, intelligence officers. The functions the ninja once performed were not left vacant. They were assigned to supervised retainers who could act with documentation and legal backing. A samurai could question, search, detain, compel. A ninja faced the same objectives without any formal authority and therefore depended entirely on stealth and risk. That shift mattered because stability doesn't tolerate uncontrolled methods. Covert violence and extrajudicial action can thrive during chaos, but they become liabilities when order becomes the project. The Tokugawa regime required procedures that were predictable, controllable, and defensible within its own rules. Samurai enforcement was authorized and recorded. Arrest was legal arrest. Punishment was legal punishment. The system replaced extrajudicial effectiveness with judicial authority, and in doing so, it tightened its grip without needing to hide. The registry systems were the final inversion of ninja methodology. Ninja thrived on anonymity, untraceable movement, unclear identities, uncertainty about who belonged where. Tokugawa governance attacked anonymity itself. It built a society of records, every person anchored to a household, every household tied to registries, movement monitored through documentation and checkpoints. In the world where identity was tracked and travel was watched, the old freedoms ninja relied on were not merely dangerous. They were increasingly impossible. Communication was absorbed in the same way. Where ninja once relied on secret couriers, codes, and trusted signals, the Tokugawa state expanded official channels, roads, stations, authorized messengers, standardized reporting. Information moved through state arteries faster, safer, and under legal protection. The regime monopolized communication as thoroughly as it monopolized violence, and when the official channel becomes the most reliable channel, the need for secret channels shrinks. Even when certain techniques remained useful, the state refused to outsource them. Methods, lock manipulation, scaling, disguise, infiltration could be documented, taught, and assigned to selected retainers under supervision. The knowledge survived, but the autonomous practice was strangled. It was the regime's pattern everywhere. Internalize capability, destroy independence, preserve the tool, erase the hand that could wield it on its own terms. The economic model completed the replacement. Ninja worked by contract, paid per mission, surviving on demand created by instability. Samurai were sustained by stipends and grants that rewarded stability. When order held, income held. Their personal incentive aligned with the state's incentive, keep the system intact. The ninja marketplace had often profited from fractures. The samurai hierarchy profited from their closure. By the mid-17th century, the transformation was complete. Intelligence, surveillance, enforcement, special operations, everything that had once made ninja valuable now lived inside institutions staffed by supervised samurai. The ninja weren't simply defeated in battle. They became obsolete. The country no longer had voids where they could operate, or needs only they could fulfill. The state didn't just close the door on them. It rebuilt the house so that door no longer existed. This is how states erase threats they can't tolerate. Not through endless suppression alone, but through replacement that makes the threat unnecessary. Build infrastructure that performs the function better. Create institutions that do legally what was once done illegally. Absorb the knowledge while eliminating the autonomous practitioners. But one question remains, one that unsettles the modern myth. If the ninja understood what was happening, why didn't they fight back? They were trained for subversion. They had networks, skills, and experience operating against stronger forces. Yet organized resistance was minimal. And the reason isn't cowardice. It's the terrifying arithmetic of power. What happens when survival means becoming invisible in a world designed to make invisibility impossible? Modern audiences expect resistance. Centuries of romantic storytelling have trained people to look for the heroic last stand, the doomed warriors who refuse extinction and choose glory over survival. But the ninja didn't fight back in any meaningful way. And it wasn't cowardice, it was cold calculation in the face of a war they could not win. Direct confrontation meant annihilation, and it has to be understood viscerally. By the time the Tokugawa order solidified, Japan had been unified through overwhelming force. Armies moved in the tens of thousands, backed by firearms, fortified castles, supply lines, and administrative reach. A ninja community might consist of dozens, maybe a few hundred, optimized for covert work, not for holding ground against systematic military suppression. The imbalance wasn't dramatic, it was fatal. Ninja were built for infiltration, assassination, intelligence, tactical tools designed for a fragmented landscape where power was divided and authority was porous. Those tools matter when you can slip through gaps, when you can strike individuals, when you can destabilize rivals who are already fighting each other. They do not win open wars. You can't assassinate your way through an army. You can't sabotage your way out of a national crackdown. You can't infiltrate your way past a system designed to make movement traceable and identity legible. What made ninja effective in chaos became inadequate against consolidation. Some clans learned this brutally, in public. Iga is the clearest lesson. When Oda Nobunaga moved to eliminate Iga, resistance happened, terrain knowledge, defensive preparation, combat skill, and it didn't matter. Overwhelming force arrived, and everything was burned, hunted, slaughtered. It wasn't a battle in the heroic sense. It was extermination. The outcome wasn't close enough to be called a contest. That lesson traveled faster than any courier. It didn't need to be written down. It only needed to be understood. Fight openly, and you disappear completely. The regimes driving consolidation weren't looking for negotiation. They weren't looking for partial submission. They were removing autonomous power centers as a principle. And any group small enough to be labeled ninja was small enough to be erased. But there was an even deeper trap hidden inside the idea of resistance. Fighting back would have validated the state's narrative. It would have proven publicly that ninja were a dangerous parallel force requiring suppression. Silence, by contrast, preserved ambiguity. If ninja remained quiet, accepted marginalization, blended into other roles, some individuals might survive. Resistance would offer the regime political cover for total eradication campaigns, and the public justification to treat every suspected practitioner as an enemy. This is the asymmetry that breaks romantic stories. If you resist, you prove you're a threat and accelerate your own elimination. If you comply, you still lose your profession, but you might keep your life. Neither option saves the ninja world. One option just ends it faster and drags everyone down with you. So invisibility, once the ninjas' offensive advantage, became their final defense. During the Sengoku period, invisibility was a weapon. Strike, vanish, leave no attribution. Under Tokugawa consolidation, invisibility became a survival tactic. Disappear into civilian life, sever connections, burn or bury records, stop training new generations in ways that could be detected. The goal wasn't preserving the profession, it was not being identified and targeted. Some did this so completely that their survival became untraceable. They vanished into occupations the state could classify: peasants, merchants, monks, minor retainers, until even historians struggled to separate absence from silence. These may have been the successful ones, not the ones who won, but the ones who avoided becoming a case study. Others tried to preserve something: a reduced identity, limited training, a half-life of techniques and clan memory. But half-invisibility was often worse than visibility. It left traces. It created lines that could be followed. It kept a name alive long enough to be monitored, absorbed or erased later. In a world built to eliminate unsupervised capabilities, leaving evidence was not continuity, it was exposure. The calculation was brutally simple. Ninjas don't defeat armies. They don't overthrow consolidated governments. Their capabilities are tactical, not strategic. And tactical talent can't overcome a strategic reality. The most powerful force in the country had decided their autonomy must end, and it possessed resources and reach that ninja communities could not match. Fighting meant dying while accomplishing nothing, and likely making everything worse. A crushed rebellion doesn't just remove the rebels. It produces interrogations, captured networks, extracted names, widened suspicion, expanded sweeps. Your death would be immediate. The consequences would spread outward. You wouldn't preserve your way of life. You would hasten the regime's ability to map and dismantle what remained. Survival meant disappearing, not necessarily fleeing geography, because borders and checkpoints increasingly made that temporary at best. Disappearing identity, becoming unrecognizable, letting the profession die so individuals could live. This is why there is no glorious narrative of ninja resistance. The ones best suited to survival did not produce dramatic endings. They evaporated. They chose erasure over martyrdom because the profession was ending no matter what they did. They chose time over spectacle, life over legend. Modern interpretations want to label that choice as courage or cowardice. It was neither. It was pragmatism under overwhelming pressure. When a centralized state decides your autonomy is intolerable and you have no strategic means to resist, bravery becomes another word for quick extinction. And disappearing is not weakness. It's the last move available. But even disappearing wasn't the final death. Because what the state couldn't fully destroy with force, it could neutralize with narrative. The ninja survived in a stranger form, as entertainment, as folklore, as a myth so exaggerated it became harmless. And that transformation, from threat to spectacle, may have been the most complete victory the samurai world ever achieved. The ninja died twice. First as a profession, crushed by force and made obsolete by administration, then as a memory, rebuilt by entertainment into something so impossible that the real history became unrecognizable. And this second death may have been more complete, because it erased even the ability to remember what had actually been lost. Kabuki helped begin the transformation. By the late 17th century, with real shinobi effectively gone as an independent class of operators, theater companies needed shadows to move across the stage. Villains, infiltrators, figures who could appear and vanish. The ninja offered perfect material, mysterious, outside normal society, associated with secrecy. But Kabuki wasn't trying to preserve history. It was trying to hold attention. So the ninja of the stage wasn't a patient observer or a contracted specialist. He was a spectacle. On stage, ninja didn't succeed through reconnaissance and discipline. They walked on water. They vanished in smoke. They transformed into animals. They performed the impossible because the impossible is legible to an audience in a way quiet methodology is not. Real shinobi work, watching, waiting, blending, exploiting routine, doesn't read as dramatic. It reads as absence. Theater can't sell absence, so it replaced method with magic. The iconic black outfit grew out of this world, and it had nothing to do with historical practice. Real shinobi wore what made them disappear by looking ordinary: farmer clothing in rural space, merchant clothing in towns, servant clothing inside the places they needed access to. The point was invisibility through normalcy, not through a uniform that screamed ninja. Indeed, but kabuki stagehands wore black to signal they were invisible within the narrative, present on stage without being part of the story. When a character needed to appear as a shadow, the costume borrowed that convention. The audience understood the code. Later generations forgot it was a code and mistook it for fact. This is how myth neutralizes threat. A supernatural ninja who throws smoke and performs miracles is not politically dangerous. He is fiction. He can be admired, mocked, defeated, and safely consumed. The real ninja, operators who understood human routine, architectural weakness, covert communication, and psychological pressure, those were dangerous because their power was practical. It could be copied, it could be redeployed. It belonged to the real world. So culture moved them out of the real world and into fantasy, where their skills could not threaten anyone. Superpowers replaced strategy. Real shinobi success came from patience and systems thinking, studying targets, understanding patterns, finding the smallest fracture in routine and widening it. That is dangerous knowledge because it is learnable. It requires discipline, not magic. But mythological ninja succeed through innate supernatural ability. No one can be trained to walk through walls. No one can learn to disappear into thin air. Myth converts a replicable craft into an unrepeatable miracle, and in doing so, it seals it away. The state didn't need to crush this mythology. It could live with it. Fictional ninja were harmless. They entertained while obscuring what had once been a genuine structural problem. The practice had been eliminated. Now the memory was being softened, reshaped, made safe. Each generation raised on theatrical ninja became a generation less capable of recognizing what the historical profession had actually been. By the 18th century, ninja stories spread through popular fiction, but they bore little resemblance to reality. The ninja became a stock character, exotic, mysterious, powerful in a theatrical sense, yet ultimately ineffective against righteous samurai protagonists. Again and again, the narrative resolved the same way. Order defeats chaos. This wasn't only entertainment, it was reinforcement. Samurai rule was not merely victorious in history, it was victorious in the imagination too. That mattered more than it seems. Force can suppress a profession, but professions can re-emerge if conditions change. What is harder to revive is a memory that has been transformed into caricature. When something becomes folklore, magical, exaggerated, safely defeated, its real-world logic becomes difficult to recover and even harder to take seriously. Myth doesn't just distort, it disarms. Meanwhile, whatever accurate knowledge remained had nowhere to live. Some families tried to preserve fragments privately, but without practical application, knowledge degrades. Techniques shaped for 16th century realities become curiosities in a later world. Methods designed for fragmented politics lose meaning under unified administration. Even if pieces survived, they survived without context. And without context, they could not remain whole. History became entertainment, and entertainment replaced history. By the 19th century, outsiders trying to understand Japan encountered the myth and sometimes treated it as reality. The black costume, the supernatural abilities, the exotic arsenal, because the myth had overwritten the record so thoroughly that it became the most visible version of the past. And even when modern historians tried to dig back toward the truth, they had to tunnel through layers of stage convention, popular fiction, and romantic exaggeration. Sources were contaminated. Narratives had been edited by centuries of repetition. Separating practice from performance became its own kind of excavation. The final death was cultural because culture decides what can be remembered. The Tokugawa system eliminated the ninja operationally. Popular culture eliminated them historically. Between suppression and spectacle, the shinobi were erased so completely that most people today don't picture an intelligence professional navigating gaps in authority. They picture a magician in black, throwing smoke and vanishing on cue. And that is the ultimate neutralization. A magical ninja is safe. He belongs to entertainment. But a careful operator who understands human weakness and structural vulnerability, that is dangerous knowledge. Turning the second into the first wasn't an accident. It was the final victory of the samurai world, not just removing a rival capability, but rewriting the memory of that capability into harmless fantasy. And generations later, when people say ninja, they mean magic. Not methodology, not strategy, not the profession that once terrified consolidating power. But every victory has a cost. The samurai world won completely, centralizing force, eliminating autonomy, and shaping the narrative of what came before. And the Japan it built demanded a price most stories don't mention. The samurai world achieved everything it set out to accomplish. Unified authority, predictable violence, total order. 2.5 centuries of peace under Tokugawa rule. By the measures a state cares about, it was a triumph. But the triumph carried a price. Japan would feel long after the fighting ended. Because when you eliminate autonomous power, when you seal every gap in control, you don't only eliminate threats, you eliminate possibilities. Order became absolute in ways that would have been unimaginable during the Sengoku years. The Tokugawa system didn't simply stop wars, it removed the conditions that produced wars. Social mobility hardened into class hierarchy. Movement narrowed under checkpoints and documentation. Information became something managed and filtered. Daily life was regulated, supervised, constrained. The result was stability, but stability achieved through pressure, through narrowing, through suffocation. Vigilance became constant and universal. The surveillance infrastructure built to replace ninja functions did not fade once the ninja disappeared. It expanded. Neighborhood associations watched their own. Temple registries tracked households and affiliations. Travel required papers. Gatherings required permission. The state could see where people lived, where they moved, who they met, what they did. This visibility prevented conspiracies and rebellions. It also made privacy and autonomy increasingly rare, almost unnatural. Every profession became supervised. In the fractured world before consolidation, there had been pockets where people could move. Craftsmen with independent leverage, merchants with room to maneuver, artists with space to experiment, communities that negotiated their own norms. Under Tokugawa order, those pockets were tightened. Guilds were monitored. Commerce was licensed and bounded. Cultural production leaned toward approved patronage and accepted forms. Creative energy didn't vanish, but it was channeled, shaped into work that reinforced stability instead of challenging it. Peace was built on control, not consent. The famous Tokugawa peace was not the absence of grievance. It was the inability to translate grievance into organized action. Peasant discontent still existed, but coordination was suffocated by surveillance and structure. Merchant frustration still simmered, but reform meant challenging hierarchy, and hierarchy was the foundation the entire system protected. The regime didn't eliminate desire for change. It made change structurally impossible. Creativity was sacrificed systematically. Innovation requires deviation. Deviation requires tolerance, space to fail, to test, to break precedent without being treated as a threat. But the Tokugawa machine was built on precedent and conformity. Deviations looked like instability. Unfamiliar ideas looked like disorder. Intellectual and creative energy was directed into refining established forms rather than tearing into the unknown. The period produced extraordinary craftsmanship, deep mastery, and disciplined beauty, yet often at the expense of risk, rupture, and reinvention. The state grew strong while society grew rigid. Administrative capacity became comprehensive. Authority became efficient. But this strength required constraining every other source of dynamism. Merchants could not easily challenge samurai status. Intellectuals could not safely question foundations. Artists could not freely explore themes that unsettled the order. Strength at the center demanded weakness everywhere else. Controlled motion, controlled speech, controlled ambition. This is the paradox of total control. It produces stability, but it prevents adaptation. The Tokugawa system was brilliantly designed for the 17th century, but when the 19th century brought pressures that required rapid change, the same mechanisms that protected internal peace became a straitjacket. Adaptation demands autonomous decision-making, experimentation, and tolerance for failure. The system had spent 2 centuries treating those traits as threats. It had trained society to obey, not to improvise. The end of shadows also meant the end of certain freedoms. During the Sengoku period, chaos created danger, but it also created openings. People could relocate, reinvent themselves, seize opportunities between warring powers. It was brutal, but it was fluid. Tokugawa order removed the danger by freezing the fluidity. Social position hardened, location became trackable, options narrowed into predefined routes. Safety was purchased with possibility. Historians argue over what Tokugawa peace represents. Some see enlightened governance, stability, prosperity, protection from constant warfare. Others see stagnation enforced through repression. Both contain truth. It was peaceful by the standards of the age. It was also oppressive by any standard of individual autonomy. The question is not whether it worked. The question is what it cost. What Japan gained is easy to name: an end to the constant warfare that had devoured the country for more than a century, political stability that allowed economic growth, social order that reduced arbitrary violence. Those are not small achievements. The Sengoku period was brutal, and for many people, Tokugawa stability was relief. What Japan lost is harder to measure because it appears as absence. The spaces where autonomous action could exist, the gaps where unconventional methods could be tried, the tolerance for people operating outside prescribed roles. You can't point to a single vanished building and say, that is what we lost. The loss is the accumulated weight of what never happened, what could not be attempted, what could not survive long enough to evolve. The ninja elimination was a symbol of that transformation. Shinobi represented autonomous capability, unconventional effectiveness outside direct supervision. Their destruction was necessary for the system being built. But it also destroyed the model they embodied, the possibility that power could exist beyond official channels and still be effective. The samurai world didn't just remove a rival, it removed the idea that alternatives could ever be allowed to exist. When Perry's black ships arrived in 1853, they exposed the cost of perfect internal control. Japan faced an external challenge that demanded rapid adaptation, unconventional thinking, and experimentation under pressure. But the Tokugawa machine had been designed to eliminate exactly those impulses. A society trained for stability found itself vulnerable to disruption that did not obey the system's rules. The samurai world had won completely. It had centralized authority, eliminated rival power models, and maintained order for an unprecedented duration. But it won by constraining everything, and constraint becomes vulnerability when circumstances change. The ninja model was chaotic, unreliable, and dangerous to stability, but it was also adaptive, experimental, and capable of responses outside the script. In eliminating one, Japan also eliminated the other. This is the cost few stories linger on. Every system optimizes for some goals by sacrificing others. The samurai world optimized for stability and control, and achieved them with terrifying effectiveness. But it traded away autonomy and adaptability to do so. And when the world demanded what had been sacrificed, the bill arrived in full. The ninja world didn't fall in battle. It was replaced, not because it was weak, but because it no longer fit the future Japan wanted. The samurai world brought order and erased everything that couldn't be controlled. If you enjoy dark, real history beyond the myths, subscribe to Fragments of History. Like the video to support the channel. And comment below, from what city are you watching this story?